Imagine a world where the cannons at Waterloo thundered a different victory, where Napoleon, bloodied but unbowed, stood triumphant over Wellington's crushed lines and the Prussian reinforcements never arrived in time. History tells us Waterloo was the end of an empire, but what if it was only the beginning of a second, darker chapter? What if, instead of exile, Napoleon reclaimed his crown with iron resolve and Europe's fate tilted not toward peace, but perpetual war, repression, and authoritarian order? Stay with us because we're going to unravel a reality where the modern world emerged not from the ashes of Napoleon's defeat, but from the long, unyielding shadow of his victory. Napoleon's victory at Waterloo would begin not with fireworks in Paris, but with the stunned silence of a continent expecting his downfall. In our timeline, the Duke of Wellington and Marshal Blucher's combined forces broke Napoleon's last gamble. But in this alternate world, Blucher's Prussians are delayed, perhaps caught in a longer skirmish with Marshal Grouchy, or misdirected entirely. Without the crucial Prussian reinforcements arriving at Plancenoit, the British lines, battered all day by relentless French assaults, finally shatter. The Imperial Guard does not retreat. Instead, it advances. The British army crumbles. Wellington himself may fall in battle or retreat in disgrace, forever altering British morale and leadership. Paris erupts in jubilation. The tricolor flies not in defiance, but in pride. Napoleon is no longer a desperate gambler returning from Elba, but the resurrected Emperor of France, victorious against the odds. The Seventh Coalition collapses into panic. Austria sues for a fragile peace. Russia, far away and logistically overextended, withdraws to regroup. Britain, reeling from its loss and a decapitated army, retreats from the continent entirely. The dream of finally ending the Napoleonic threat is gone. But here's where things begin to darken. Napoleon, once restored, is no longer a revolutionary idealist nor a pragmatic ruler. He is hardened, paranoid, and vindictive. His victory was hard-won and nearly lost. He now believes betrayal lurks everywhere. Liberal reforms that once characterized early Napoleonic rule are swept aside for militarized centralization. The French Empire, vengeful and self-righteous, turns inward to purge enemies both real and imagined. Former royalists, moderates, and anyone who questioned the empire's resurrection are exiled, imprisoned, or executed. Meanwhile, the rest of Europe finds itself in disarray. Britain, humiliated, sees its parliament fracture under public outrage and fear. Calls for a massive rearmament ring out, but internal divisions stall action. Ireland, seeing British weakness, becomes a powder keg. Revolts rise. Scotland's nationalist voices grow louder. Britain's empire begins to tremble, not from Napoleon's armies, but from within. Prussia, humiliated and bleeding from its losses, turns increasingly authoritarian. The seeds of militarism are planted even earlier than in our timeline. Nationalist rhetoric blames foreign interference and weak leadership. A younger generation of officers, some of whom in our reality would later be key to the unification of Germany, become disciples not of balance of power diplomacy, but of total war and survival at any cost. Austria, caught between a vengeful France and a retreating Russia, begins to unravel. Its patchwork of ethnicities, Slavs, Hungarians, Germans, and others, feel the growing pull of nationalism in the face of a centralized French menace. But without the Congress of Vienna to stabilize post-war Europe, these tensions are unaddressed and fester, leading to civil unrest, crackdowns, and eventually regional implosions. Napoleon's imperial ambitions, reignited by Waterloo, expand again, this time more slowly, more calculatedly. Instead of massive campaigns, he engages in political subversion, economic warfare, and targeted occupations. The Netherlands is absorbed more directly. Northern Italy becomes a permanent satellite. Spain, never fully tamed, sees another invasion. This time, the guerrilla war is answered with total retaliation. Cities are razed, entire provinces depopulated. Napoleon's empire begins to resemble not a beacon of enlightenment, but a militarized leviathan. And yet, from the outside, much of the world sees order. Trains run on time, roads are repaired. Art flourishes under state patronage. The French education system becomes the gold standard, but it is rigid, controlled, and designed to instill loyalty to the emperor and suspicion of foreign ideas. The Napoleonic Code spreads, but with modifications that enshrine imperial supremacy and weaken civic freedoms. France becomes the cultural and bureaucratic core of a Europe that is orderly, but cold, brutal, and surveilled. What of the Americas? Here, too, things change. The United States, having just recently emerged from the War of 1812, looks nervously at the return of a powerful, aggressive France. In our reality, the Monroe Doctrine was declared with the confidence that Europe was too exhausted to meddle in the New World. But in this alternate timeline, a triumphant Napoleon has the means and motive to challenge it. French fleets patrol the Caribbean. Napoleon's agents support French loyalist factions in Haiti, attempting to re-establish colonial rule. The Louisiana Purchase is questioned. Napoleon demands reparations or threatens naval blockades. U.S. expansion slows under this renewed threat. Texas, Mexico, and other regions remain battlegrounds for proxy wars between French interests and rising American ambitions. South America's independence movements face brutal setbacks. Without British support, military and naval, that helped leaders like Simón Bolívar, these revolutions falter. French and Spanish loyalist forces, emboldened by Napoleon's second wind, launch coordinated campaigns to crush dissent. South America may remain shackled under European empires for decades longer, delaying or even preventing the rise of independent republics. Slavery, too, lingers. Upheld by the colonial regimes Napoleon protects for their loyalty, Napoleon's return also accelerates the militarization of technology. The Industrial Revolution does not flourish under free market experimentation and scientific openness. It is directed by state militaries. Railroads are first laid not for commerce, but for troop movement. Telegraph lines are placed with battlefield coordination in mind. Steam power becomes a weapon of conquest, not a tool of commerce. Civilian life is perennially in the shadow of war preparations. As decades pass, the aging emperor turns to succession. In our timeline, Napoleon II never ruled. But in this version of history, Napoleon grooms his son, the King of Rome, as the inheritor of a pan-European empire. Dynastic marriages, strategic purges, and manufactured referenda ensure a continuity of Bonapartist rule. The Second French Empire becomes not a temporary restoration, but a transgenerational regime. This has profound consequences for the ideological trajectory of the 19th and 20th centuries. Liberalism is crushed early. Nationalist revolutions, such as those of 1848, either never happen or are swiftly and bloodily repressed. Without the successful examples of democratic reform in Britain and constitutional monarchy elsewhere, Europe becomes a continent of empires clinging to power by force. The ideological spectrum narrows. You are either with the empire or against it. Communism, too, faces challenges. Without the failures of liberal regimes and the rise of capitalist exploitation in fragmented Europe, Marx's ideas find less traction. But where they do emerge, they are even more violent, born not in critique of industry, but in opposition to entrenched imperial autocracy. Revolutionary cells in Poland, Germany, and Italy become radicalized earlier, resorting to terrorism and sabotage. The cycle of repression and revolt becomes bloodier. The 20th century dawns not with hopes of modernism and democracy, but with imperial entrenchment. World War I does not erupt as we know it, because Europe has already been at war, in low-intensity conflicts and internal purges for nearly a century. The Great War of this alternate world is a series of rolling civil wars, insurrections, and colonial clashes that never quite end. Africa is carved up by France and its client states with even greater cruelty, driven not by economic competition but by ideological conquest. Without a humble Germany to rise anew, there is no Weimar Republic, no National Socialism. But there is authoritarianism, plenty of it. From Russia to Spain, local strongmen rule under the watchful eye of Paris. Surveillance becomes normalized, literacy rises, but freedom of thought shrinks. Science is monitored, religion is tolerated only when submissive to the state. The Catholic Church, once an opponent of revolutionary France, is brought to heel with concordats that neuter its power. And what of the modern world? In this alternate present, the European Union as we know it does not exist. Instead, there is a centralized, continental directorate, headquartered in Paris, run by descendants of Napoleonic bureaucracy. Elections are held, but only from within approved parties. Freedom of the press is cosmetic, protest is limited and brutally suppressed. France's cultural dominance remains, but it is artificial, state-curated, and enforced. Britain, though eventually recovering, never regains its 19th century dominance. Without the imperial leverage or the moral authority gained by defeating Napoleon, its global influence fades. India still seeks independence, but faces resistance from a Britain that is itself more autocratic, shaped by decades of reactionary fear. The Commonwealth becomes insular. The Anglosphere fractures. The United States becomes the only true liberal democracy of scale, but one constantly under threat. Isolationist in the 19th century, it is forced into hyper-militarization in the 20th, not against Nazi Germany or Soviet Russia, but against a Napoleonic Europe that spans from Lisbon to the Caucasus. The Cold War is not between capitalism and communism, but between constitutional democracy and dynastic authoritarianism. Proxy wars erupt across Africa, Asia, and Latin America, not for ideology, but for influence. The space race still happens, but differently. The moon is claimed by French astronauts under the tricolor, not Americans planting stars and stripes. Satellite networks are weaponized. The internet, if it exists, is tightly censored, a tool for imperial propaganda and surveillance rather than open communication. And perhaps, most hauntingly, the dream of a free and cooperative world, the post-war order, the UN, the Declaration of Human Rights, is never realized. Without the trauma of 2 world wars to force reflection, without the Holocaust to expose the depths of authoritarian evil, the world never builds those guardrails. Instead, tyranny becomes banal, resistance becomes rare, and humanity, though advanced, walks forward not into freedom, but into silence. Because sometimes, a single battlefield does not just decide a war, it reshapes the world. And when Napoleon won at Waterloo, he didn't just defeat Wellington, he defeated the future.